Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to give people a few more minutes to jump on the line here. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're giving people just a couple minutes here to log on. All right, I'm seeing a few more people joining. I'm going to get us started here. And as people join, we will welcome them in. Okay, so welcome to the second meeting of the Land Use and Natural Resources Working Group. I think I'm hearing a little bit of background noise right now. If you don't mind muting. Okay, I think it's gone. Wasn't sure who that was, but if you don't mind muting if you're not talking, I would appreciate it. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you for joining and welcome to our second meeting. Next slide, please. If you haven't used WebEx before, oh, and also my name is Ruchi Sudhir. You saw that on the slide earlier. If you haven't used WebEx before, this is a slide that helps you to kind of orient to WebEx. And just to kind of walk you through this a little bit, there's a couple of different options to raise your hand at the bottom and then also by your name. There's also, if you don't want to raise your hand, we could also, use the chat, which you can see in the bottom right. And then if you would like to change your name or how it looks, you could hover over your video. You'll see 3 dots and you can edit your display name. You can put your organization and your pronouns there if you'd like. And then if you are dialing in through the phone, you could use *3 to indicate that you'd like to join our discussion. If you have any issues, technical issues, you can let us know in the chat. My colleague Abby is on the line and she's on deck to assist. I'll also mention that all the working group members are panelists. You should be able to mute and unmute yourself. I'm hearing a little bit of background noise. I don't know, Abby, if you can tell that might be coming from, or if you can also help us with muting. Okay, I think it's gone. And then we have members of the public joining us. Thank you for being here. Welcome. You're joining in as attendees. And if time allows, we really would love to have a public comment period where you can raise your hand. Any quick questions before we go any further? Are you able to hear? Okay. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So quick reminder of the purpose of our working group. We are having these working group meetings as an opportunity to inform Oregon energy strategy, and we brought the group together because we want to hear your thoughts and questions. We really appreciate your experience and your expertise. If you are able to, we'd love for you to have your camera on so we can kind of gauge if you're smiling or it looks like you have a question. We'll be watching for that, as well as your chats and raised hands. We have a few community agreements that have been helpful. We encourage you to listen carefully, seek to learn and understand each other's perspective. We're encouraging respectful, candid, constructive conversations and for you to keep an open mind. Please ask questions to clarify and understand the why about someone's comments. Be open, transparent, inclusive, and accountable. respect that there may be differing opinions, and be conscious of speaking time. Feel free to speak and let us know if you have questions, but think about stepping back and allowing space for others to contribute when you see others raising their hand or wanting some feedback opportunities. Let's see, slide 4. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, here's our agenda. So we're continuing our conversation that we left off with last time. Michael's going to kind of go through some more land use natural resource considerations. We're planning on having a discussion about the reference scenario and potential what if scenarios. And we're planning on using a little bit of time for a share screen on the RESA tool, kind of a little bit more engaging to make sure we have an understanding of how that one works. And then we'll wrap up at 3 o'clock. Okay, next slide. So, it says here if you didn't join our last meeting, but, it's been enough time that I would encourage you to all just please share in the chat your name, your affiliation, the geographic location you represent. And then, we did an icebreaker last time around like what you're doing over the summer that's fun, that's, beyond just this working group, which is of course very fun. And so I'd love to ask you, what is your favorite place in Oregon to visit in the summer? If you could add that to the chat, really appreciate it. And seeing some really great introductions in the chat. Thank you for playing along. Love all the beach references and backpacking in the mountains, Southern Oregon coast, rafting on the Rogue River, Blah Mountains alongside the Lostine River, Lake Billy Chinook. Love it. Giving me ideas for the last days of summer, I guess. Hey, thank you so much. Next slide, please. Hey, I think this is where I think we pass it back to me, right, Michael? Or do you have a piece before this?
Well, I guess I can jump in here and talk about what we talked about last week, just to give you a break. I know you were just speaking for a little bit. So last week we talked about some of the data and assumptions that will go into the reference case energy modeling. And so just a reminder, so that reference case is our kind of our baseline to hit our greenhouse gas emission goals that we've established for the state. And so we're establishing that reference scenario, and then we'll take a look at a variety of other scenarios to kind of compare to that reference scenario. So if you remember last week, we were talking about kind of the Power Place West screens that had been used for that study. And we kind of got asked for feedback on what kind of reasonable assumptions would work around kind of land use screening, and how restrictive to be, or how likely certain categories of land would be likely to be used, from a reference case like a baseline to being maybe more restrictive or less restrictive, or another way to think about it is less likely to have energy development build on that land, or more likely. And so we kind of looked at those different categories, and we wanted to bring that back up because what we heard from you is that you needed greater detail on, what are those individual filters, and need a little more visibility of that. So we're going to bring that back and try to have a conversation about that. And I do want to talk about it at a high level. If you think of the model and what we really need to feed the model, it's really thinking about the area available in Oregon as a whole. So we're thinking about the state at a macro level. So not necessarily site specific, or what's the looking at a particular site, like how suitable it is for energy development individually. It's more looking at the state as a whole and saying, okay, statewide, how much land is really available for energy development, and giving that kind of the whole number for the model. Unfortunately, it's, the model lives in that kind of like really macro level at a high level. And so we can't really get to individual areas, but that might be something when we get to the policy phase that then we can kind of add some context to some recommendations around policy and say, okay, well, here's what we think about certain areas and what should be included or excluded in development in the future. So that maybe that policy phase will be a better opportunity for us to dive into that. Okay, so I think that's some level setting. If I could pause, does anybody have any questions about that level setting?
And I have a couple slides that kind of cover the same thing, but I think it's a good time to pause to see if any questions so far. Well, let's keep talking. I think that we're going to get to some more engaging areas too. So last time, like Michael said, we talked about power of place. This was a study that the Nature Conservancy worked on that looked at a lot of different geospatial data to think about options for screens. And so this slide shows how they thought about it. There is one, and we're kind of figuring this out with you all. So as we understand the model that Jeremy talked about last time, there is kind of like a default that they can use to think about the question of how much we should think about, like, what amount and what type of energy supply might be available in the future. So a necessary influencer of that is what land might be available for projects. If it's a land area that has a lot of wind and it is available for development, maybe we would see more wind in the future. That's kind of the nexus between the two. This was a screening exercise Power of Place did, where they looked at different categories, and you see some examples there, and they excluded it from development as part of the assumption. So I think that the way Jeremy talked about it last time is that would be sort of our default. I think that he has that data already. He has the sort of exclusions. That would probably be the easiest way for the model to run, using what Oregon what was excluded from the land based on Power of Place. And I'm not necessarily an expert on Power of Place, but that is kind of the default that we heard from Jeremy. And then I see one hand up. Oh yeah, go ahead, Michael.
On the DLCD Rules Advisory Committee process, we met with folks from the Boardman training site, and surprisingly to many of us, to me at least, they did not have concerns given certain considerations for instance, solar development within their footprint. Things that projected up wind towers were more of an issue. So I wouldn't necessarily assume that training areas are out of reach.
That's a really great point. There's also this like level of nuance of what type of development. Is it a high tower that might be an obstruction? I see what you mean. And that's something that I've also been thinking about, to be honest. I'm not sure if that Power of Place got into the level of detail on that sort of type, and that might be something we can follow up to see and understand that if we kind of went with the default of, Power of Place, what would that mean in terms of that question? So
yeah, and likewise, level 3 prime farmland, there's been discussions about the opportunities that agrivoltaics or dual use might play on farmland, and that folks might be more open to that type of dual use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great idea in terms of like exclusion for type and resource impact. Let's go to the next slide, and then maybe this will kind of expand on this discussion a little bit. So kind of reiterating what Michael was saying, you know, in real life, the life that many of you are actively working on projects, you know, in real life, there are evaluation processes. You know, sites are considered for potential renewable energy projects on a case-by-case basis. Those developers go through processes that evaluate, you know, legal and regulatory requirements. There's public feedback meetings. There's, you know, very specific on the ground evaluation that happens to ensure, at least in the FSEC process as an example, that they meet certain standards. In addition to that, you know, there's land purchase or leasing costs. So, you know, and project developers, they consider a variety of environmental, physical, regulatory factors that can influence the amount of investment needed. You know, that's like time, financing, contracting for project development. So there's sort of a lot of things at play with project development. And that's, you know, one way to think about whether or not projects are happening or not is there's a significant consideration about, you know, the evaluation process as it relates to time, financing, contracting for these developers. And so that's the real life. That's what's happening for many of you, you know, who work in this space. The model is different. The model is not real life. It's not even a prediction of real life. It's really a forecast. It's you know, considering a lot of different factors that might help us understand what future energy demand will look like. You know, there's a few other groups working groups that have been thinking about what those assumptions might be. And then the model picks between a bunch of different energy resources that could be the supply to meet that demand. And it uses, you know, a least cost and availability and reliability to sort of think about that and pop out some options that could be ways to meet that. And so the nexus to our conversation is kind of how Michael teed up. You know, it's not specific to a project. It's not the real life project. It's more about getting to should the model, how reasonable is the model in terms of thinking about how much and what type of energy resources in that supply and the options there. And that's influenced by the potential land that might be or might not be available for certain energy projects. So that's kind of like the, you know, on the slide version of what Michael was saying with a little bit more detail to build on last time. Next slide, please. And so, you know, that how much and what type of energy resource is not location specific in the model, but the location matters as an assumption for the type and how much. So it's a little bit nuanced in that way. It's a little indirect. You know, the model's not trying to predetermine or judge site suitability for specific locations. It's being more generic about how much and what type as an input. And so we have this reference case that you heard, and that's really, you know, what are your all's reasonable assumptions about areas where you're seeing projects being approved or built today? We're trying to get like an accurate sense of what's happening on the ground right now in the reference case to compare to a what if scenario. And we heard a lot of really interesting questions and comments last time about, you know, if there were more restrictions or more protections in place on development. That was a what if that we heard a lot of interest in. You know, you would assume that there would need to be more evaluation of land use and natural resources, or perhaps more, you know, legal prohibitions on development or something in that future. And so that's kind of the way that we're like indirectly getting to that how much and what type by leaning on your experience and expertise to help us understand what assumptions would make sense in those two scenarios. I'm going to pause there for questions and then see how we're doing on time. I'd love to show you the ARISA tool as a mechanism to try to look at, you know, what a reference case or a what if scenario could look like on the map. But I'm going to pause here for questions before we do that. I'm going to give you some like silence to think about that awkwardly too, because that can sometimes help with questions. Okay, I'm giving that was pretty awkward in terms of silence goes. So not seeing anything in the chat yet or
Richie,
any
it looks like
raised.
Michael has his hand up.
Oh, good. Okay. Go ahead, Michael.
I'm a little confused because you're talking about the scenario and the models not being location specific, but then you're asking for a reference case scenario which is specific.
Mhm.
And it's hard to not think of specifics because everything is kind of based on the specific conditions in the location that makes it possible. So
Mhm.
I don't know. I'm just a little confused about that.
Yeah, I appreciate you asking to give me another chance because I sometimes feel confused about this too. So the way I understand it is, and maybe it's like a language thing too, that we're using the word scenario too many times. So the way I understand it, and I would welcome Seti and Michael and others to sort of jump into, is that the model is a technical model that's running about energy. So it's an energy model. It's not a land use model. It's not a natural resources model. There are lots of models like that, and I think they're great. This particular model is about energy. But we know that land use and natural resource um, evaluations and considerations are a really important component to the question of what energy supply might be available for the model to play around with. So when we're saying that the reference case scenario is this math problem about energy, there is an input in there about energy supply that we think would be influenced by assumptions about availability for development. So that's where it does get specific in terms of your assumptions, like our assumptions around whether or not there are areas in the state that might be available for development in the future for solar. That's probably really going to be tied to specific resource considerations around habitat, around military use, around agriculture. I mean, all of the things that you might specifically think about with an actual project on the ground. So it is kind of both, I guess. Like the model itself will not be location specific in terms of, specific project predetermination. But in terms of looking at a map and trying to understand resource potential, resource is another word we're using multiple times, energy supply potential, I think that it's sort of an indirect relationship. So I think on the side here where it says, reasonable assumptions about areas where you're seeing projects being approved or built today, that's trying to get to the sort of what is sort of the current state of where you all are seeing projects being approved or built, to give us a sense of, if nothing changed at all, then this is the sort of snapshot of the type of resources that might be available in the future for the sort of technical model to consider in the energy supply. And then for the what if, in this what if, the way we have it described here, and perhaps you have, different what ifs that would be of interest, in this what if, you would imagine that the energy supply in the model would have fewer options because there might be less land available for development because of, perhaps in the future there's more legal prohibitions, or there are considerations that end up requiring, time financing or contracting that doesn't end up panning out. And so in that case, the energy supply input would be fewer options, and you might see in the model different things pop up, like maybe there's greater emphasis on rooftop solar or greater emphasis on energy efficiency. So the model's kind of looking at it in that picture, but the map itself in terms of reasonable assumptions would influence the supply question. Did that help at all, Michael? You can say no if it didn't. Okay, well, I see John's hand up, but Michael, if you want to jump back in. afterwards.
No, I think you're good. I was just going to let you know that John had his hand up.
Oh, okay.
So I hit my head a little bit earlier, so I might not be thinking quite straight. I hit on a ladder of all things. Don't do that if you can help it. So Marucci, I'm thinking, having listened to you. So I mean, could it be a simple? The reference case scenario is, we've seen all of us seen projects built. Those projects have been primarily built on private land, deeded land. The what if scenario: what if public land, federal land, BLM land was made more available in the future? I mean, is that kind of an arrangement that we could be thinking about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that could be a what if. That if this group thinks that would be like valuable to try to suss out, if there was more land available for development on BLM land, how would that affect other parts of the energy supply and demand equation? But I think the expertise in this group would help us to make sure we're being realistic on that. What are the reasonable assumptions in the reference case? And if you're seeing, pressure points on specific land use or natural resources that maybe in the future would have more legal prohibitions or have more litigation associated or something, anything really that would make that kind of more costly for a developer to actually see a project through, that's kind of like we want to get the benefit of your expertise and experience in that. So maybe it would be helpful to sort of share screen a little bit on some of the examples. But I'd also, yeah, okay, great. So if you wanted to kind of follow along with the ERISA tool, we're going to attempt to sort of pass the ball and I'm going to share screen. So if you happen to see my email or something, I apologize in advance. Okay, please share. Okay, hopefully you're seeing something come up here.
We do see the ERISA tool, Richie. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I'm not sure how familiar you all are with this, but one of the things that one of the things that we're using as sort of one way that we could ask for your feedback in a more detailed way about this idea of which resources or land use considerations are realistic to consider for the right now and in a potential what if scenario is to actually go data layer by data layer and think about it and talk about it. And one way that we, are thinking about this and looking to your feedback as to whether this would be a helpful exercise for you to sort of focus your feedback and input in this space is looking at what data the Power of Place folks used and seeing what the Oregon specific kind of version of that, which is basically our ERISA tool, as a way to sort of look at the data or the natural resource areas that might be the ones in your experience and expertise ends up involving a lot of consideration, in the sort of right now as well as in this potential, what if scenario. So, I loaded this before, but sorry, the very front of it, it says explore data, create report, other info. So I just clicked on explore data and this is what you would see. So as an example, the folks that put together Power of Place, they had certain things that they just indicated were, legally prohibited or not technically feasible. So we would kind of, click through some of those things, but I don't want to focus on that one right now. But those would be things like National Wildlife Refuge or a wilderness area or a wilderness study area, state parks, national wild and scenic rivers. Those were the types of things that were just in the legally prohibited for Power of Place. I don't think there was much debate about that because it's just the law, I guess. And then there were other I guess, data layers that have more like you would have to evaluate it on the ground to know. And so some of those layers were considered to be, excluded from development potential in Power of Place. And those might be the ones that might be more interesting for you all to give us feedback on. So I'm going to click through, and they used, various different data sets that we have in the ERISA tool as well. So there's some good correlation there. And then there's other ones in the ERISA tool that are more specific to Oregon, like that ODFW and other state agency partners have worked on with INR and Oregon Explorer team over there. Okay, so the first one is just looking at protected areas. So if you click on natural resource considerations, I'm kind of focused in on Bend here a little bit, but I can zoom out for now. And you click on protected areas and you click that on. You'll see a lot of different pieces come up. This data set includes legally protected lands throughout the US. It's compiled by USGS. And so if you wanted to know more about what that is, you could click. Sometimes you can also click on the little polygon itself, but one really easy way is if you just click on the arrow, it'll tell you what that data set includes. Another way that you can, let me click this off for now. Another way that you could look for something that might be of interest for you to make sure, hey, for the model, you should consider, wetlands inventory to be very protected in a what if scenario or in the reference scenario. If you're not seeing, many projects coming through successfully being built or being even approved for development in wetlands, that would be good for the reference scenario to tell us, like, well, on the ground, we're not really seeing these types of projects move forward right now. So an example of that would be like if I typed wetlands in here, it kind of pops up all of the different data sets that are available in the ERISA tool. So you can kind of click through and see the National Wetlands Inventory here with some more specifics. The other way that you could get here is through the natural resource considerations itself. And then if you X this out, you can see the whole layer again. Another one we thought, from the Power of Place list that we think have probably some strong considerations for the right now, as well as a potential future if there were more restrictions, is farmland soil class. So if you type soil class in here, you see it come up in the natural resource considerations. So if I click that on and kind of zoom in a little bit, might take a second to load.
Oh, Ruchi, sorry, this is Mirka. Just one quick thing. You turn on the natural resource considerations folder. That one got turned off. So I think if you turn that on.
Oh, thanks. Merica's here as my I don't know, buddy. If you want to introduce yourself, Merica, Merica's from the Institute of Natural Resources and helped develop this tool. So if there are technical questions, she's on the line to help. Thank you, Merica.
Absolutely.
And then, so you can see the different farm land soil classes in different colors here. So there might be some indications of, again, what you're seeing in the right now in terms of potential projects actually being approved, being built versus a what if scenario if there were more restrictions. And that would help us to sort of understand this question of where land might be available in the future with more restrictions or in right now as that sort of difference on supply. Let's see. And then the last one I wanted to make sure that you had seen as an example was wildlife connectivity areas. That was also a spot where in Power of Place there was some discussion about, whether there were, projects being proposed right now that were being successfully built, or in a future where there were more restrictions and protections in place for conservation of these areas, what the land would look like in that scenario, or in that example, or in that I guess, view. I keep saying scenario, but in that view of the land. And then last but not least, is if I just kind of focus on the question of, I know DLCD is looking at this too, but where there are currently transmission lines or where there might be more solar potential, and different, basically like what the potential for solar or power generation from solar is, you would see these different gradients, kind of as a reference. Okay, so that's one idea we have. Basically the default, just to recap, is that Jeremy already has data from Power of Place, could use that as the assumption in the model for land availability. And that would influence the variable in the reference case for how much, what type, and how much energy resources might be available for supply. That would be a reference case opportunity. If this group wants to help us think through a more Oregon specific way to influence energy supply, we could ask for your feedback on specific data layers in the ERISA tool to sort of create two different scenarios that the model might be able to explore, which would be this reference case of today, and then a scenario where what if there were more restrictions, what land would become less available, how would that influence other outputs from the model in terms of solar on rooftops or more energy efficiency. Those are things that I'm guessing would happen, but I would be curious to know what the model would show, or if there's a different what if scenario. So I'll pause there and just see, because we have some ideas on how we could collect that information from you. We're not like ready to do that in this moment. We could take notes, of course, but we want to give you more time with the ERISA tool and kind of with the list of data layers that Power of Place considered for your consideration if you all want to go down that path or would find that to be useful. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment and just kind of look at all of you in the face, I guess. Okay, here you are. And see if you have thoughts or feedback on what we've shared so far. Hey, go for it, John.
So I've already had some space in the room at the time, so I don't need to take up any more oxygen than I need to. But I would say a couple things. One, I think the ERISA tool is a fantastic asset. Spent a year of my life trying to figure out what that should mean, and America McCune and her team are brilliant, and I think we're fortunate to have them there today. A couple of things. I would be a little cautious about fully or completely relying on the soils layer. It's good. It's an indication. But I think to really follow up, it might not be the definitive source, but it's a good place to start. And if I can use the ERISA tool, anybody can. So I would definitely encourage people to play around on it. It's a lot of fun. It has something for everybody.
Thanks, Sean. Other thoughts on this idea of just sticking to sort of what the default would be with Power of Place as a reference and not go into the what ifs, because we don't have a what if opportunity with that, I think, or kind of getting your feedback through the end of the month on specific data layers in this or ERISA specific what if or reference and ERISA specific what if of more restrictions. Oh,
Oh, sorry.
that's okay. Go ahead, Anne, and then we'll go to you, Emily. Thanks, Emily. Oh, you're on mute, Anne. Oh, I still can't hear you. Is that me, or can others hear Anne?
Nobody can hear me? I'm
Oh, I
off
can hear you
mute
now.
on my end. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay.
You're good.
I was going to say, I feel comfortable with using the power of place as a starting place mostly, but then at the last thing that you said kind of confused me because I thought that was going to be for the reference scenario, and then we still are going to have what if scenarios. Is that right, or is that not correct? 'Cause what you just said made it sound like we
Yeah,
do
that's
that.
good clarification. So I see Ruby's hands up. Maybe she's going to help me answer this question. But my understanding from the modeling team is that power of place is a sort of map of exclusions. There's a few different siting levels that we showed you with those maps, and so you could just use those siting levels for the one of those siting levels that we kind of shared screen on before as a reference case, and you could pick a different siting level for the what if that is the path that this group is comfortable with. But I would love to confirm that with Ruby, who has her hand up.
That's what I was going to clarify as well, that it would still allow for the opportunity to test one case versus a more restrictive case, but you wouldn't have as much customization within the layers or of the layers within each of those cases because those are already set within Power of Place. They have level 1, 2, and 3. Whereas if you went the ERISA route, it would be more choosing the specific layers rather than being defined by the Power of Place.
Thanks, Ruby.
I just wanted to add that I thought that there's a good comment in the chat there from Dan Series about water, which is not, I don't know if that's in the power of place. That seems like a really important thing to about moving forward. And also just to reiterate that I have a concern that ocean resources in the power of place aren't up to what I would think is good. But anyway, but other than that, I think it's pretty good.
That's great feedback. And also maybe less work for you all. I mean, I think that's one consideration too, is if we went down the route of trying to sort of build our more customized with the help of this group, we have some ideas on how to collect that data, but we would try our best, but we would want to see if it reached the level of accuracy. I think that power of place has been, vetted through, but another consideration for you all. Emily, go ahead. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, I've only heard great things about Power of Place, but I just wanted to see, I think I saw someone from TNC, Lauren. Oh, yeah, there you are, Lauren. Not to put you on the spot, but I was just curious if there's anything that you recall about Power of Place, and if there's like anything that we should especially be paying attention to, or perhaps was missing then that we should be looking to include now, or if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. Yeah, I think it was Anne who spoke about the marine considerations. I would say that is probably one of the weaker points of the data. And so following up on that, my question would be more so around, does it need to be like only Power of Place or only the ERISA tool, or can it be like a Power of Place starting point and adding in some more marine like data layers? Because that's kind of, I think, where TNC would land, recognizing that there are some considerations there that just aren't probably up to the caliber that this group would want.
So I think what you're describing, Lauren, might be I don't know, what's it call it? Homework after summer camp exercise with the ERISA tool. And that is something that I think our team is really interested in doing. We would need all of your help though. And so it would be, we recently, and I don't want to, he's not even on the line, so I can put him on the spot. We recently brought in a GIS analyst to Odo, and he's literally, in his 3rd week. So he had other things to do, but we told him that if this group was interested in going down this path, we would need to bring him closer in to ask that question. But he has sort of the ability to look at, what Power of Place had, and we could explore with your feedback which layers might make sense or not. And we were hoping to use the ERISA tool as a way to sort of have that visual conversation. But I don't think that with the sort of default, which would be use Power of Place, and choose between those 3 levels for like a reference or a what if, which is perfectly fine if this group is like comfortable with that, you know, that's the kind of feedback we're looking for from you. That would be the sort of alternative. I think I saw Eileen's hand go up. Maybe she has something to add to that.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to say is I'll check with Jeremy on this, but I think that, you know, Lauren, if you have that data, that marine data, if we can get that marine data, we'd sure want to see it. I would think, though, that he would want to put it into the reference case, assuming that you thought it was really valuable, because Power of Place is weak on the ocean and marine. So if there are good data that we could have for that, I'm almost positive he'd say, let's put it in the reference case. I don't think it would warrant a what if scenario, because the whole project only gets 5. Like the entire strategy, the modeling gets 5 scenarios. So I don't think you'd want to use it in a separate scenario, but I can certainly ask him, because if it's good and Power in Place is not as strong, then I would think he'd want to put it in to the reference case. So we can take that as a, you know, something we can follow up on with him.
Actually, another kind of follow up, and then I really appreciate that. Before we pass back to Lauren for that, Michael, if you could go share a screen on the slide deck again and just like bring back that slide that had the levels on it, because I think there's 2 questions. There's like the data set, which is the what we're hearing feedback on, that there's not a ton of marine data, but then there's also treatment of that data. So that's what the levels do. So I just, you know, even if you had the marine data set in there, I think, I don't know, and Jeremy's not on the line, and so we definitely should take this as a follow-up. But like one thing to consider is how it would, where it would fit in this leveling kind of. So I'm just kind of scanning through on like and there's like a longer description of this stuff. So maybe it's in the longer description of treatment. Do you see what I mean, Eileen? Yeah. Okay. Okay, Lauren, go ahead.
Yeah, and I guess maybe this is kind of relates exactly to what you're saying, where like I think even at TNC, you know, we utilize the Power of Place West data as more of just a tool, not really an expression of policy. So like maybe as we get into those policy conversations, it also makes me think about the offshore wind roadmap and that whole process, which I think could really inform this, but I know it's not the same timeline. So I don't, not sure where that leaves us, but maybe even if that work group that really pushed that offshore wind roadmap concept, maybe they have essential data layers that could be helpful. I don't know.
Yeah, and just I know that John has a colleague, Andy, who has like Oro Wind Map, and when we developed the ERISA tool, we had Andy in the room to like figure out, should the ERISA tool have all this like marine data? They were spending so much time and effort focused on or a map that we just kind of reference, hey, go to this other map for that. And so I know they have a lot of data in Oro Wind Map, and then you're getting to sort of the roadmap, which is more of like this leveling kind of it's not a leveling conversation, but it is kind of that feeling of developing a roadmap of like considerations, right? So you're right in that the timing isn't aligned enough to have that in place for this question. But I think it is a good question to just ask Jeremy, like, if there was more data available, can Evolve's GIS person, I don't know, we don't know that, but we can maybe follow up on that question. So then it kind of, I know this is hard because have a couple follow-ups, but we'd really, if we're going to go down the other path of sort of using the ERISA tool to like develop our own map with our, I shouldn't say map, our own kind of, you go back down to the other slide. Let's see, not the next, I think it's, yeah, this one, one back. So if we went down this scenario, or not scenario, like homework, summer camp homework of developing our own reference case scenario with feedback from you on sort of these reasonable assumptions, creating kind of like this visual for us in GIS using your feedback on data layers of which land might be available right now versus a what if. That would involve more effort from you all to sort of go through that with us. We would be able to provide, I think, a spreadsheet that has the list of the data layers that Power of Place used. And we would sort of give you that as a starting point and then ask if there was sort of feedback. And I have a spreadsheet that's like a work in progress. We don't have it done because we weren't sure if we're going to actually use it with you all or not. But if you wanted to see that, I can kind of briefly share a screen to say, this is the kind of thing that we were thinking of collecting your input if we wanted to go down that path. So let's see. We can, if you want to stop sharing screen again, Michael, we can see if there's any other thoughts or questions. Go ahead, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you for all of this information. I'm just kind of catching up. Kelly Campbell is normally the person here. So one of the points that she gave me the notes from last time, and I looked at and saw that water was not a big factor. It's definitely a constraint in some places where we've seen big gas plants or large facilities that would be long-lived. Anyway, there were some really good data layers in that tool, not surprisingly. So I don't know if that would be a way to get something into the reference case that at least acknowledges, for a project that would need to remove or fill, this is going to be problematic as one example. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Dan. I think that, so two thoughts there. One is I'm kind of feel like it might just be time to just show you what I'm looking at maybe while I'm trying to have this conversation. Acknowledging that this is definitely a work in progress and we are not done with it, but this would be the sort of way that we would try to think about getting feedback if we wanted to go down the sort of not using Power of Place, but maybe building from it to have some more customized pieces, which is that we have a column here on what we understand Power of Place to have used, and it has kind of a descriptor and like a parenthetical of the data set. We also have kind of these X's where they indicated that it was like legally prohibited or not technically feasible. And then, we internally were trying to go through an exercise of like, if there was a reference scenario, if there was a what if scenario, like where would you kind of put the X's or what kind of detail would we need? And so probably need to be more nuanced in this, as an example, we don't have enough detail here to say like, maybe for solar versus wind, is it a height restriction or is it a glare issue? It can get pretty detailed pretty quickly. So that might be reason enough for you all to say we decline the summer assignment, but this is how we would think about it. That we know what the data layers are that we think Power of Place considered. We could do an ERISA data layer crosswalk. We would try to fill this column E out before you all get this, and then you would have a chance to provide some additional context or comments for treatment. Give us probably only have to put that in once. But basically help us understand where you think the reasonable assumptions of today are. So the water piece to your question, I'm kind of skimming through here to see. I see waterway classifications, some wild and scenic rivers. I don't know, Dan, if you're like able to see this at a big enough level to kind of skim with me, but
yeah, I can. Thank you.
Okay. So there's like the wetlands inventory that I shared screen on with the ERISA tool already. And then, yeah. And I think that we would also be open to like, if there's a row in the ERISA tool that you're not seeing in column D, like maybe that's a treatment that we could customize into it. So that doesn't fully answer your question, Dan, but that's how we would try to address it. Maybe if we, went through that. Oh yeah, essential fish habitat. Yeah, it's a good question in the chat, Anne. What doesn't Power of Place cover? Yeah, not being an expert in Power of Place, it feels pretty, comprehensive, but there are probably, data sets that are missing or considerations missing. And that, I think I have to say it's probably always going to be the case to some degree, because it goes back to the in real life, the site specific, looking at a project through an FSEC process or something. Oh, good. I'm glad that was helpful, Dan. Well, I don't know, Michael Friels, if I think I only had half an hour, so maybe I'm taking up too much time, but do you all want to think about it and kind of, if you have really strong thoughts on I really want to use Power of Place. I think the levels, this and this are what you should use for a reference case versus a what if case. Or if I really think there's some stuff missing and we should explore adding to this in some way through this spreadsheet that we're trying to build, or stop with the spreadsheet. We have too much to do this summer. That's the kind of thing that would be really helpful to hear from you right now, or in the next couple of days. Any other sort of questions or thoughts? Okay. We'll add it to the chat if it comes to you later. We're still online here for another hour or so. Thanks. Go ahead, Michael.
Great, thank you, Ruchi. So, as Ruchi pointed out, we could certainly come back to that conversation as we go, and we've got a variety of other discussion questions that are related to what we're just going over. So I'm sure some of these things will come back. But we did want to talk through some of the stuff that's come out in some of the other working group meetings related to land use and natural resources, and incorporate that in some discussion questions. And there were some discussion questions in our previous meeting that we didn't quite get to. That this is kind of an opportunity to check back in on. So the Transportation Working Group met last Thursday, and they talked about a variety of things, in particular, vehicles miles traveled per capita, vehicles miles traveled per capita reduction, and whether that should be included in a reference scenario or in a alternate scenario within the energy modeling. And so, as a refresher, so vehicle miles traveled is important because it's really important for transportation to meet their greenhouse gas reduction goals. So electrification and fuel switching alone won't help, or will help, but won't fully meet all our greenhouse gas emission goals on the transportation sector. But reducing vehicle miles traveled is kind of that third leg of the stool to meet our goals. And vehicle miles traveled is a good kind of reflection of improvements in public transit and spatial planning and alternative modes of transportation. A variety of different alternatives can be reflected there. And so we're kind of looking at, should vehicle miles traveled, like a reduction target, be part of that reference scenario or an alternate scenario? And just as a frame of reference, historically, since about 1990, our vehicle miles traveled in Oregon per capita has been pretty flat. It hasn't dramatically gone up or down. And so, and also want to mention that the Oregon Transportation Plan has a per capita reduction of 20% by 2050. And so that's certainly an aspirational goal, because there isn't enforcement attached to it, and there isn't direct funding to that specific target, but it is something to keep in mind. And so it exists on the books, and we're trying to think of whether that should be in the reference scenario or, again, in an advanced scenario. And if you're thinking of the energy strategy or modeling as kind of like not a prediction of the future, but maybe the value is in being able to test the reference scenario from an alternate scenario, you might think of keeping the reference scenario as kind of like reasonable assumptions, and then maybe something advanced like a high vehicle miles traveled scenario might be a great opportunity for something to test. So I want to check in with this group and kind of get their feeling for it, because certainly we had that conversation in the transportation group, and I'd love to hear from this group, what your thoughts are at that level of, should there be a target within the reference scenario? What should it be or should it be an alternate scenario? And Michael, looks like you've got your hand up.
Yeah, Michael, thanks. Just to clarify,
Yeah.
are these reductions just based on improvements in mass transit and efficiency and spatial planning, or is it converting internal combustion miles to electric vehicle miles?
So that would be an efficiency gain of making that. So it does include that electrification, but I think at a high level, you're right. It's more spatial planning, public transit, and I think that's where we'd see it more than just the efficiency of the vehicle. Yeah, hopefully that answers your question. Oh,
Well,
go ahead.
it wasn't efficiency just in terms of miles per vehicle, but I mean, if we're talking about reducing the vehicles driven by vehicles that are powered by internal combustion, those are a certain kind of vehicle miles, and then miles by electric vehicles seems to be a different kind of set of miles. So are you mixing all of those miles together, vehicle miles together, or is miles driven with electric vehicles a separate category that you're pulling out?
This would be separate. So electrification of transportation, switching to EVs, think of that as a category, and then thinking of, I mean, they're all interrelated. You know, fuel switching from petroleum fuels to other low emission fuels, or electrification is kind of another category, and spatial planning, reducing vehicle miles traveled is another category. But you're right, they're all kind of they overlap significantly. They're not fully independent of each other. But it's kind of looking at you know, what do we think is kind of a baseline or a reasonable assumption for the future with vehicle miles traveled, and what should be in the reference scenario versus something we might want to test. And I know it came up previously in the last meeting, concerns around kind of rural areas. And if you look at some of the planning around that, the focus is on, there's a greater reduction target for metropolitan areas. As we know, there's certainly challenges of doing that in some rural areas. Okay, so there isn't any strong feedback on whether that should be part of a reference scenario, or perhaps an alternate scenario that we test?
Maybe silence means that makes sense.
Well, I guess,
Mike has
yeah,
a
right. I mean, so you guys, maybe I'm misunderstanding the question. I mean, are you guys putting this to us as saying, does this make sense? If so, I think the answer is yes, in my mind. And I also, I guess, would support kind of the notion that this might fall into more of an urban contribution, because that's where the growth is happening. That's where, you know, new development is happening. That's where the potential and the options and opportunities for more you know, transportation options and less vehicular dependent development can occur, so on and so forth. You have the densities to support community services and mass transit, those sorts of things.
Yeah, so I think the question is whether it would be whether our target would be in our reference scenario or an alternate scenario. And I guess my recommendation would be, it looks like historically with vehicle miles traveled, we've been pretty flat. So maybe we shouldn't assume that within the reference scenario, and maybe take a look at that as an alternate scenario, so then we can test kind of the difference, the path going forward. But maybe if we have a limited amount of alternate scenarios, so maybe that could be something that's part of the reference scenario. And so it sounds like, you know, it sounded like, John, you're on board with including it in either the reference or alternate scenario, so we could see.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't see any downside. I just see upside.
Okay.
I agree with Mike Yang. You know, I mean, it might help to understand, you know, or help us understand. So I think you guys probably do understand it better than me anyway. You know, how the relationship between combustion supported vehicle miles traveled and electrical vehicle miles traveled. But that feels, for me, that feels like there are differences. I think we're really looking at, a reduction in vehicles that are dependent upon fossil fuels, being the big factor there.
Yeah, so I guess we can follow up and make that distinction, but it sounds like people on board with including a vehicle miles traveled target within the reference scenario, or perhaps in an alternate scenario. Michael, do you have your hands up?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably something for that transportation group to wrestle with, but to me, it needs to be based on verifiable assumptions. Are there mass transit expansion plans in place that have made these estimates, or is it based on just greater adoption of people switching from their own vehicles to using mass transit? What kinds of land use planning efforts are underway to rationalize transportation systems in urban and suburban areas? I mean, where is that 20% coming from? I mean, is it based on behavior changes, or is it based on actual projects designed to increase the availability of mass transit?
Yeah, and I guess hearing from you or hearing you describe that question, that makes me think of it as more of an alternate scenario that it's something we would test against kind of our business usual, how we're going, and that would help us show the value in maybe achieving those targets. So maybe it's not what's planned out for the next couple of years, but it's what would be the value in setting that goal, and then we would develop policy recommendations to achieve it if it looked like, oh, here's the economic or land use or other benefits to achieving something like that. That would be kind of in our technical analysis, and then in our policy recommendations tied to it. Okay. So now I'm going to move on to
I
our.
want to check. I think I saw
Okay.
Mike from OHA have his hand up and then maybe came back down, but just wanted to double check. He didn't have.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Ruchi. I think Mike Eng does a great job of actually asking a lot of my questions for me there, and John follows up there too. But I had a similar question, or I guess my first assumption was when we're talking about a reduction in miles there, I was just thinking we weren't necessarily traveling less. That was just being a smaller proportion of the miles driven from internal combustion engines. So that was helpful to get that clarification there. Also, was just curious about where the 20%, how you arrived at that. Was that based off an emission reduction target, or something that seemed reasonable, or just, we plucked a number out of the air and we're going to test it, or how that came about?
Well, I actually don't know the history of, so this is from Oregon Transportation Plan. So this is from ODOT, Oregon Department of Transportation, set this as an aspirational goal. So I don't know the history of coming up with that 20%, but certainly we could find out for you and share that with the group. But ultimately, it is kind of a aspirational goal. It would be tied to, a variety of different things, not just the efficiency of vehicles or taking vehicles off the road. It's a variety of things like public transit and using other alternate modes. So, encouraging more people to bike, encouraging more people to walk, and all these other things, and certainly in urban areas more so. But yeah, I think it's an interesting thing to take a look at. And if you're thinking of the energy strategy, again, this is not a prediction of the future so much as a way for us to test things and be able to show the value or the cascading effects of some of these things. So if we took a look at that, how would that change Oregon and the way we use energy if we were to achieve that? Is kind of the activity of the model itself. And so not necessarily a prediction like we will definitely hit this point, so much as what would happen if we were to test that. Another way of showing the value of it, I guess.
And I guess from that perspective, if
Yeah.
you're thinking it's really aspirational, maybe it's not suitable for a reference scenario. and perhaps it's better, but it would be useful to see what the influence is on a broader
Yeah.
scale.
Yeah. Oh, Michael, that's you got your hand up, Michael?
And now that you said it came from ODOT, I would think their concern is road maintenance, and fewer miles or more miles means more or less road maintenance and budget consideration. So yeah, I don't think that is adequate in and of itself as an aspirational goal coming from ODOT to model as the reference myself, maybe as a what if, and as long as all the assumptions are clarified about it.
Okay. That's great. Yeah, thank you for all that feedback. Okay. Oh, looks
I
like
see one
Andy, you
hand
got your hand up?
Oh, she said never mind.
Okay, well,
I was trying to give a thumbs up for what you guys just said and accidentally pressed raise hand. Sorry about that.
That's okay. We got a verbal thumbs up here. That's great.
Yeah,
Michael.
that works. Oh, and then we have Toby, you have your hand up? Oh, maybe I was just seeing things.
Yeah, I don't think I saw that. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. All right. So another meeting we had last week was the Environmental Justice and Equity Working Group met and talked about a variety of issues, but certainly land use came up in the conversations, and particularly related to kind of energy siting and consider around kind of the energy transition and the potential for continuing to negatively impact communities or perpetuate existing problems around siting facilities. And so, that was a conversation. Vehicle miles traveled came up in that group as well, talking about how to encourage alternative modes of transportation and looking at how the energy strategy might be able to help with that. But really what we heard was kind of the concern around like siting facilities and how kind of least cost energy development may continue to lead to burdening already burdened communities in Oregon. And just a lot of concern around kind of how the model would address that. And so I wanted to bring that to this group and certainly make some space to see if there are some things that we should take a look at in the technical analysis or limited within the model, kind of the data that can feed the model around equity and environmental justice, but it really is something in the technical analysis of that modeling and interpretation of those results that we can take the kind of equity and environmental justice lens and look at that and look for opportunities, especially when we start developing policy recommendations. So I wanted to create some space and see if there's recommendations this group had or things that we should really take a look at and highlight in that evaluation related to kind of land use. Yeah, Michael.
I don't want to be hogging the time, but if no one else raises their hand. So the siting of energy projects in rural communities, I think is an equity and environmental justice concern. Those communities are going to be receiving the impacts of those energy development projects. And so I think it's important that they receive some kind of special, I'll call it compensation, but it's consideration, for the impacts that they are enduring as a result, especially if a lot of the benefits accrue outside of their communities. So, I think that needs to be focused on in terms of level and the degree of the impacts and what types of creative compensations, if you will, can be addressed to that community. And I think when it comes to energy, those things might be might be a guarantee and that might be special uh, 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 taking place in those communities as opposed to having to come in through some
Mike,
other means.
to let
But
you know,
yeah,
like, having a really hard time hearing you. I just want to let you know we were fine up until this type of you know, issues would need consideration, and then it just, you got very warbly there. And try again.
yes, broadband and rural is an equity issue. But the
Yes.
point was is that for those communities that are impacted by development, that I think environment is an equity how to make up for that, and some possibilities might be rate reductions or rate stabilization. They might be assurances of resiliency for that local community, such as a microgrid for that community. Those kinds of issues to help compensate for the fact that many of the benefits are leaving that rural community, but that rural community is subjected to the impact of the energy development.
Okay, so Michael, you were cutting out a little bit, but here's what I retain from what you're saying is, you know, a lot of these energy development locations or new development is happening in rural areas. You want to make sure that those rural areas have access to the benefits of that new energy development, whether it's microgrids or have access to kind of rate reduction or something like that, because they are taking on the burden of new facilities. And I think there's going to be an opportunity in the technical analysis and then in the policy development conversations that we'll have in the first quarter of next year. We can certainly explore that and have some of those conversations. So that's great feedback. And please let me know if I missed anything of what you're saying. Oh, thanks. And John, did you agree on that?
Michael, just so I can make sure of the notes, what I heard being said was insurances of resiliency and microgrids for the communities were two of the ideas that I heard. There was one other that was garbled, and I don't know if that was rates, because I didn't hear anything about
rate reduction or rate stabilization.
Okay.
Some protection against rate increases, perhaps.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Also, you know, including EV chargers in that community. So, you know, how to the local community.
Michael, that was electric vehicle charging. Was that what you said? So people could take advantage of those opportunities.
Right. So that it's not just, you know, everything's not just going up to the transmission grid, but there are actually facilities there to benefit the local community.
Makes sense. And John Jennings, did you want to say something?
You know, I've already had my voice in the room. I'll yield to Anne if she'd like to go first.
Okay, I'll just follow up. Last week, I thought that Michael brought up something really interesting about the data centers and the cryptocurrency mining areas as an environmental justice issue. And the way I see it is that sometimes, like, the decisions we're going to make about the energy choices we make are going to like lead to winners and losers in the economy, or people who are people who might lose their jobs, people who might get jobs. You know, there are those kinds of things, and the only way I can think about those is to start brainstorming about them. Some of the things Michael brought up now are more like mitigations that'll come later. So the only way I can really be that I'm thinking about this is maybe, you know, is there a way to prioritize those locations or space? I mean, for our discussion of natural resources and spatial stuff that have co-benefits, you know, like places where there is an opportunity to find, you know, siting of energy and existing uses or something like that. So that's just a thought.
That's great. And I think you mentioned a note you sent to us about, agrivoltaics or trying to utilize multiple uses with that energy development within sites or using brownfields or existing
Brownfields, yeah.
infrastructure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's an opportunity certainly when we're talking about like what if scenarios, looking within the state at distributed resources or putting solar or something like that on existing facilities versus new development and what's the value in that and whether transmission's constrained or land use is constrained and does that value does it become more appealing to cover existing rooftops or with solar or other resources? Yeah. Okay. Any other feedback or recommendations on kind of that technical analysis of kind of the modeling results with kind of equity, environmental justice in mind?
Michael, I guess support what I've heard so far and just emphasize. I think that, we talked about a couple of things here. The reduction in vehicle miles traveled is kind of an urban thing, right? Delivery of large scale energy projects is more of a rural thing, I think. And whether that's, utility scale solar in Lynn County or utility scale solar in Morrow County, or offshore wind, on the southern Oregon coast. That's more of a rural thing, and I think that those communities stand to feel as though they're being exploited, perhaps, and that would be unfortunate. I'll just kind of leave it at that.
Yeah, so I think these are all Oregon things, and so we have to find a way to balance the benefits as well as the costs.
That's right. Well, I mean, so for the transportation piece, the urban areas are going to hopefully be the beneficiaries of pedestrian friendly development and transportation choices and transit and have things that make it more amenable for them to not have to drive as many miles. A lot of people in the rural areas feel like they're going to be sentenced to having to look at large scale energy development for 30 or 40 years. And which I'm not saying that's true. That's how things have to happen. But there's a feeling, or could be a feeling, if we're not sensitive, that some rural communities are being sentenced to endure things for the benefit of the urban areas. And I just don't want to lose that. I'm not saying that's anybody's intention or how it would even actually turn out. But I think we need to be sensitive to that perspective.
Yeah, that's great, John. Thank you. Agreed. Okay. Any other last feedback before we move on to the next section? Okay. All right. And then I guess kind of in line with the previous question. So after the modeling is complete, I know we heard from Dan some concerns about kind of water issues with development, and certainly the analysis include more detailed consideration of kind of siting impacts and water consumption and biomass consumption. This is an opportunity to kind of let us know what you think would be valuable, kind of a technical analysis or information to kind of pull out of the energy modeling in these different scenarios. What is the impact, as Dan pointed out, what is the impact to water? What is the impact of biomass use or other kind of inputs? These are just examples. What would you want to find out from this energy model, from the technical analysis that would help you with the work that you're doing?
Oh, I should raise my hand. Go ahead, John.
You go ahead. I've said a lot so far. You go ahead, John.
All right. I'm curious on the biomass consumption. In what context, given that there's a lot of different considerations that could fall into or categories of.
Of course.
Utilization.
So John, if you were thinking about very different scenarios of, let's say our reference case, and then we looked at, more clean fuel development, and it took more biomass consumption. So looking at the outputs of that, of saying, okay, in these different scenarios of like a high or low use of low carbon fuels, what would kind of be the biomass consumption between those different options? And where might it have to come from? Something like that, and look at those kind of modeling inputs. Or, I guess the other piece of that is if we were, I know we've had conversation about, the price of other fuels go up, so you need more biomass consumption. So what does that look like? Does it continue to come from in-state or out of state? Yeah, so just kind of the comparison of the prices of fuels or the use of different fuels, and what would that look like? Yeah, does that kind of answer your question, John?
Yeah, no, I think that does, and to that end, under the different scenarios, it certainly would be a point of interest in terms of generation capacity and honestly siting for that matter. As we talked about, I think previously, to the extent that distributed power is a consideration, and within those different communities. So yes, I guess as the question would be valuable, or I think opportunity or value proposition, but also location of source, given the nature of the biomass that'd be included, as it's a substantive conversation point relative to many of the forest spaces. So
Sure. Are there other inputs besides kind of biomass consumption that would be valuable in that
well,
conversation?
I mean, there's generally, in a lot of respects, this is a chicken and egg conversation that's been going a long time with respect to biomass, right? So there's plenty of supply, depending on utilization format. But then the question really becomes, what does the demand look like to inform the, I guess the acquisition of that supply, which is usually a pretty costly endeavor. There's the delta, right, between, and then also the appetite, depending on the scenario upon which that power will be, desired. So there's a constant interest in seeing better, not better, but more scenario understanding of utilization of biomass, I guess, to that end, to inform where those investments might be able to be made, or in what degree and scale they could. So it's a very fluid space in terms of what it can create but where it could come from and what informs that. So there's lots of opportunity, but there's a lot of challenge in practice, I guess, is what it comes down to. So
Sure. And broadly speaking, we're just trying to identify, I don't know, inputs or areas of the analysis that we could highlight that would be interesting or would drive interest within other state agencies, other public partners, and help with the work that they're doing.
And to that end, I think it would really come down to, opportunity, but also desirability, because there's also there's a lack of consensus around the desirability of biomass power generation for a breadth of different reasons. So, but regardless, in terms of being a potential input to the broader production arena, to the extent that it could or would be or should be included, that would be of value to informing the context of biomass in our alternate energy or resource questions and considerations. And I'm thinking in a lot of respects relative to restoration and mitigation. So anyways, I don't know if that gets to what would be valuable to learn realistically, to the context in which different scenarios are evaluated or developed, to the extent that there would be desirability or utilizability of biomass derived production for power. I'm rereading the question again. I don't know if that gets to I think I'm talking myself into a circle, to be honest, but is that answer your question, Michael, or does that get to the question as it's asked?
I think you've highlighted that, you know, it's important for the input around biomass consumption, and that would be helpful to learn and some context to it, not just just a number in itself. And we can certainly look into that and provide that. And if anything, I mean, this is an opportunity to, even if you don't have an answer right at this moment, to think about, and that's kind of feedback that would be valuable to us ahead of time, so we can kind of know what kind of analysis we need to do of these numbers and how to look at them that come out of the energy modeling, and what would be useful. So John Jennings, did you have your hand up previously?
Yeah, I did. I just, I'll be brief. I find biomass absolutely intriguing. You know, it operates more like a base load plant can, and creates jobs in the woods, which I think is interesting too. I guess I'm interested in kind of like Mike Tody posted the impacts with regards to, I guess, just sheer numbers of acres to be occupied and what different arrangements could look like. You know, if we have more, you know, wind is the energy version of building up and not out, right? Each one of those towers that are producing 2.5 megawatts, that's equivalent to 10 acres of solar. But you can build solar for $1.06 a watt. So you're right. So anyway, there's trade-offs. Water consumption. This might not be the right context at all, Michael, but we've heard about agrivoltaics, and I'm curious about how those arrangements could save water or make up where water is lacking. You know, we hear from, you know, with those situations, they stand to increase moisture. They could amount to, you know, 4 or 5 inches of rainfall. That could be an absolute game changer in certain situations, especially, you know, where we're suffering from, you know, this prolonged drought. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point, John. Agrivoltaics have some additional benefits, and that might be, I don't think the model will go into that great of detail or make that choice, but that might be something within policy development that we say, you know, as farmland's developed, we want to promote agrivoltaics in order to be able to still retain some value there, or retain soil benefits and all these other things, and the moisture benefits of that. That's something we could highlight. And Michael, did you have your hand up before? Did I miss it?
Yeah, I was going to make a similar point in terms of water consumption. I mean, I think it's probably mainly thought of as for cooling of data centers or whatever. But also, you know, if it does end up saving water, reducing irrigation needs in to the state, that could be quite significant, because allow more or less available. I mean, more of the less available water to come because of climate change to stay in the rivers for natural resource and for other purposes.
Yeah, and so that there's some benefits of taking a look at the variety of different options, supply options, and looking at impacts to water and what water would be needed. Yeah. Okay. Is there any other feedback somebody would like to provide, or questions?
I'll just note that there's been a lot of really good feedback in the chat, which I think will, you know, save as part of the feedback here.
Great. Okay. So I know we've talked a little bit about the what if scenarios throughout, but we really wanted to make some space and kind of go over these and see if there are additional what if scenarios. I know in previous conversation we've talked about kind of distributed resources. What if, you know, there's more distributed resource instead of utility scale? So instead of a utility scale solar farm being built, can there be greater emphasis on putting solar and distributed resources within, you know, on existing structures, on roofs? What is the benefit there, and kind of what's the value proposition in comparison? If we have constrained resources, we can't use as much land for utility scale solar, so we have to do it on brownfields or on existing structures. Could that be an option? Are there other paths where we invest more in energy efficiency, distributed energy, or load flexibility, have less we need to build? You know, offshore wind is certainly an option. So do we decide to invest in constructing offshore wind in Oregon, and what does that look like? Is that something we want to model as a scenario? So all of these would be different scenarios that we would compare to our reference model and take a look at the economic impacts, impacts to energy supply and demand, and can kind of learn from. So I'm curious if there are other kind of what if scenarios that you would want to for us to test and learn from. Yeah, John.
So this might be in the first bullet there, Michael. I guess I would be curious about something that might be like, what if there's more behind the meter type development supported, whether that's domestic rooftop or ground mounted arrays. I think that that kind of might already be captured in that first bullet, but I wouldn't want to lose it. I'd be curious to know, what could that look like if there's more of that that sort of, whether it's domestic or also on on the larger format destination type buildings like Walmarts and Costco's and high schools and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and there's many different ways we could do that. We could say in Oregon, new energy development, half of it has to come from existing land or something like that, or there's a variety of different scenarios and ways to look at it. So I'd be curious, any kind of feedback or what you would like us to test within that. That's a good example, John. Yeah, Michael?
I'm not sure it would be worthwhile to specify agrivoltaics, but I think that it could have a significant impact because so much of the available land, at least for solar development, would be farmland. And if there were different policy choices about, requirement of agrivoltaics on any land zone exclusive farm use or something like that, it could have significant implications, both to incentivize it and facilitate it, or to create additional obstacles to using the available farmland for instance, solar development.
Sure. So I think that touches on a couple of things, like when we're talking about the land use screens for how much land to use that would actually be available within the reference or an additional like alternate scenario, how much of farmland is available, and then thinking about in terms of kind of policy development down the road, when using farmland, is there an incentive or some kind of regulations around needing to use agrivoltaics to maintain the value of that land in some way, or maintain water or whatever it would be. Okay. Does anybody else have recommendations as far as what if scenarios that they'd like to learn from the energy strategy? Okay.
I think someone
go ahead.
put it in the chat. I think someone put it in the chat the potential of some dam removal on the Snake River, lower river. A lot of focus on that and folks working in that direction, and that could be if losing that portion of.
I'm sorry, Michael, you're cutting out a lot. So what I heard from you was that somebody put in the chat, what would the removal of the Snake River dams, what impact would that have in Oregon? Was that what you were saying?
Sorry for internet, but I mean there's a lot of focus on that right now, and working that happened of that portion of hydropower. It's like goes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Michael, you're still cutting out. I apologize, it's hard to hear you. But I think what I'm hearing from you is that that'd be a good scenario to kind of take a look at what would be the impacts of the removal of those dams, a variety of impacts to communities and maybe economic impacts and things like that. But it's a good idea. Anne, did you have feedback?
Yeah, I wanted to just uplift a comment that Mike made in the chat because I think it's really important. A number of people have kind of tweezed apart some specific things that are in that number one, the idea of brownfields, the idea of doing things that kind of on the consumer side, helping people, or I think it was said, on the other side of the meter. So that one, it seems like maybe we really need to divvy it up more to get to those important scenarios. And I just wanted to say, I don't really understand very much the last scenario about if Oregon sets a more ambitious GHG target, because one of the things that's confusing me about all of this is that it seems like each state has its own targets, but then the energy market is not state by state. So it's like super confusing as to like what does that actually mean in the end of the at the end of the day? You know what I mean? So just wanted to put that out there because it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, so I guess there's two pieces of that, right? So you're right, Oregon's part of a larger energy system, and there are limitations to what we can do within Oregon, within policy and the changes we can make. And so we do need to reflect that, and the energy model does intend to reflect what's happening in other states and how it will impact Oregon. And I'm sorry we don't have Jeremy here to give greater detail to that. But as far as what's happening in Oregon as far as our greenhouse gas emission goals, so right now our reference case is an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And so we have heard from other stakeholders that we should consider a higher scenario to look at that. How does that change? What would we need to do if we were to test like a net zero scenario or a 95% reduction by 2050? What would be the additional cost? What would be the additional supply or demand implications of that? And so it's just another way, another thing we could test. But you're right, and there are limitations to what we can do alone as one state. We're still certainly within a larger energy system. Did I answer your question, Ann?
Like that was helpful, but like if we accrue more, if we make more energy, but it gets sold to California, who does it, how does the accounting work, I guess? And I think is a policy question, but so maybe it's just not relevant because you've described it well. So thank you.
And Michael, this is Jessica. I'll jump in really quickly. So Anne, that's a really good question. And oh, by the way, I should introduce myself. I'm the manager of the technology and policy section. So the work of the energy strategy is happening with my team. And one of the things the model does that's really interesting and super weedy, and I honestly don't really understand how the model works when it gets down to the real granular level on this, but it takes into account all of the greenhouse gas targets across the Western United States when it's assuming questions about the cost relative to our electricity generation. And so by looking at those costs further and further out in the future, they're actually able to model where energy will be sold from and who it will be sold to and vice versa. And those costs then help determine what that forecast will look like further and further out. So the model accounts for the expected changes in cost of energy based on future greenhouse gas goals of different states. But as far as specifically Oregon's role in all of that, it's not solving for Oregon to produce anything more than what Oregon has said it was going to do. So that would be our clean electricity targets and things like that. So hopefully that's helpful too.
Yes, I would just add on to that for a second that what Jeremy does is he puts in all of the existing policies around the West. So whatever target every state is trying to achieve. And then especially with the electricity, it's modeling as if the whole West were one market. So there is interconnection across the states as each of the states is attempting to hit their targets. And as the years go by, the region, particularly if you're looking at it from an efficiency and a cost-effective approach, is going to become more integrated and share resources more broadly. So the model is definitely looking at California and Washington's ambitious targets, and maybe, Utah, Idaho, Montana's less ambitious targets, but they have less demand, whereas the more demand heavy states. You know, there's a lot going on behind the scenes that is very much at what Anne is asking about.
Yeah, thank you, Eileen. Mike, did you have something you wanted to add?
Just wanted to tag on to Anne's comments there too in the follow-up, and that maybe one of the bigger what ifs is the influences in this regional context. So what if one of these other states decides by policy that they're not going to export any of their green generated energy and we can't import it to Oregon? What if that happens? So what if the factor in these, if we're playing in this great big sandbox here and there's only so much we can control in that, and there's a lot of variables out there that are going to influence this?
Yeah, I think Mike, like a constrained transmission scenario is certainly one that we've talked about, and so we're trying to find that balance, right, of how much to generate within the state or to try to get out of state, and what would the cost or economic impacts of that be, whether that state wants to provide it to us or just too expensive or it's just easier to develop it. And we want to have independence within our state for a lot of these energy resources too. There's a lot of benefits there. Thanks for pointing that out. And Lauren, I believe you had your hand up.
Yeah, Mike kind of covered it. I guess my question, or kind of a what if scenario, would be this idea that the assumption we're using is that we're going to have a regional market. It seems like it is the ideal option, but I guess I would be a little bit curious about a what if scenario if that's not the case.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. So you have a lot of inefficiencies without that regional transmission system. Yeah. Nolan, did you have something you want to add?
Yeah, and I apologize if it was brought up. I had to step away for a quick sec. So one of them was the what if I think Michael Ng just posted in the chat around what if we do remove the lower Snake River dams. The other what if scenario I was kind of thinking is what if we included other non-emitting energy sources that Oregon currently does not allow.
Oh, I'm sorry, no, you kind of cut off for me.
Yeah, you faded there. Can we hear that again?
Sorry, the second, so the first part is to Michael Ng's chat about what if we remove the lower Snake River dams.
Yeah.
The second is what if we included other non-emitting energy resources that Oregon doesn't currently allow. So thinking of like small modular reactors and things like that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so within the reference scenario, right, we're following existing policy, so that could be an alternate scenario of kind of new policy, something we could add. We could certainly look at other resources and include that as an option.
And that absolutely came up in the electricity working group.
Oh, yeah.
Several people raised that.
I'm not seeing any other hands yet, and I do want to try to make sure we reserve some time for some public comments. We have a few folks on the line who are not work group like panelists, but did want to see if there were any kind of last thoughts here before we move to that. I also saw, just to verbalize some of the chat, that there was some, going back to our first kind of item on power of place and ERISA, kind of doing our potential addition exercise or exploring that at least, that it sounds like there's a link, you know, if you want to take a closer look at power of place and what those data layers are right now. There's some additional information there, and then there was some, I generally saw some, mostly silence, but just a couple of, you know, it might be helpful to at least explore additional layers of some kind. So wanted to give folks if you didn't get a chance to sort of weigh in on that, that would be helpful to hear. You can just put it in the chat if you have a strong opinion or you feel like power of place is probably a better one to go. Or if if we provided like input spreadsheet to sort of fill out, you wouldn't have time to do it. That would be helpful to know too. So wanted to bring that back up as we move to public comment.
Great. Thank you, Ruchi. Well, do we have anybody? So if you are a member of the public and you haven't had an opportunity to speak at this point, if you could raise your hand, and then we'll have Abby.
Oh, I see one hand right here. I think Andrea has her hand raised.
That's great. Can we elevate Andrea so she can unmute and speak?
Andrea Kreiner, the Executive Director of the Oregon Association of Conservation Districts, and I'm actually one of the advisory committee members. And so one of the things that I keep thinking about as you're looking at the alternative scenarios is, for example, setting a new GHG goal versus looking at a scenario which would have the state doing something, right? Because setting a goal doesn't necessarily make anything happen, but setting a policy or making an investment would, to me, be a more realistic what if, right? So that I guess I'm coming from a place of a little bit of frustration with the slow movement that we as a state are making towards our energy future. And if we're going to just model setting goals, all right, well, then the legislature will set a goal, and then it'll take another 2 to 3 years to figure out how to implement the goal. And we're just kicking the can down. So I would rather see, and this is my plea, for what if scenarios that are more action oriented than goal setting oriented.
Gotcha. Thank you, Andrea.
Sure.
Yeah,
Also, thank you for your service on the advisory group, which is meeting on Wednesday. I see Toby's hands up too.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you, Toby. Toby, are you there?
I'm trying to get it to work. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Very briefly, I've read HB 3630, and it's this very specific and yet unspecific piece of work. It's about 6 pages long. It lists all of, occasionally, some of the social equity and other concerns that the state of Oregon has. And the goal of it is to really meet our goals, which is a bit ambiguous. However, you've stated the goal is HB 2021, 100% clean electricity by 2040. And the other goal is the Climate Protection Plan by 2050. The point is that is set so far out that there's a concern about any accountability, and towards the previous comment, we have to really ask, what is the point? In HB 3630, it declares an energy emergency, but we haven't heard that word ever mentioned again. And the idea of not having a deliverable since it was passed last year, 2.5 years, is a concern. The bill states that 400,000 is to be distributed among the counties to come up with a resilience plan or an energy resiliency. Well, in rural Oregon, that's kind of tough. 50K per county, it's a tough thing. A lot of volunteers, they're not necessarily energy experts. To then take 10 times that amount, the 4 million, to fund this modeling, essentially, I think that as a least cost model, it betrays the spirit and the letter of 3630 when you should be doing a best value. Because no decision making can ever be done on a least cost. We just don't live in that world anymore. So as a government agency, if you had developed an open source code or some kind of tool that all of these great advisors could use to help you model, it just seems to me that if your goal is to, in decades in the future, only reduce your greenhouse gases a little bit, then we're kind of missing the point of it. And I think it would be a greater service. And I'm trying to be brief. A greater service if, in the spirit of 3630, which funded this effort, that we remind ourselves we are in an emergency. That climate has caused deaths, and so for those people, it certainly was an emergency. And so I think what we're lacking is, I would love to see modeling that really talked about what can we do in the next 3 years, and anything beyond that is speculative. But what can we do to actually achieve I think the intent of 3630, but this effort, although intellectually fascinating and academically important, it offers no actionable tool for the counties in which the 3630 was actually intended, or it would appear as written, to want to support. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Toby. I really appreciate you sharing that. I also wanted to just mention, I'll put it in the chat, there's a few other parts of that bill that other folks are working on. So I just wanted to assure you that there is some other work going on, and I can put a few things in the chat about that, and just generally really appreciate your recognizing the sort of emergency that the legislature recognized when they directed a lot of our work. I also wanted to pass it to Jessica to maybe double check a couple of other items that you mentioned on the cost piece. Around 4 million. I just wanted to make sure that was clarified.
Yeah, thanks, Ruchi. And thanks, Toby, for the comments. That's a really good point that you make. There's a lot going on in that bill, as Ruchi said, and it kind of crosses across many different places at Odo, as well as a few other agencies. So the funding piece of that for what we're here talking about today, which is the energy strategy part of it, we were awarded 1.2 million for work on the energy strategy, but the part that we're talking about today, which is the modeling, we were able to actually offset some of those costs with funding through the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant, which is something we're working on closely with DEQ. And so all of the modeling costs are coming through that grant that comes from the Environmental Protection Agency. And we also are doing due diligence in trying to support a lot of the other work around developing the strategy by finding other funding opportunities. We do have funds coming from the U.S. Department of Energy as well. So you were also talking about the county awards that are going out, which is $50,000 per county. And that's a separate program happening at Odo in a different group than mine. So I don't really want to talk too much about it here. And actually, I'm not even familiar with where the exact funding source came on that, but that's a little bit two different things. And I just want to make sure that we're clear on where all the different funding sources are coming from on all those different things. And if you've got more questions, please send them in the chat, and I'll happily try and answer them there.
Thanks again for those two. Are there any other hands raised for public comment period here? Not seeing any. Are you, Michael?
Not. But we are at 3 o'clock. So I want to respect everybody's time and thank everybody for making time. It sounds like we've got some follow-up. So we'll follow up and share the slides from today's meeting and the next steps. I know we've got a meeting on August 22nd to check back in and kind of bring all the working group members together and have a kind of final conversation, start talking about kind of modeling inputs and our straw man for moving forward. There also is an opportunity to obviously provide public comment, not just in these meetings, but send us notes and provide comment. We certainly appreciate it. But ultimately, we appreciate you taking the time and having this conversation today, and look forward to hearing any additional feedback you have. Please send it our way. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.